They built docks on my shore overnight, drilling straight into my land before sunrise. The sound of steel hitting wood snapped through the fog, and the smell of fresh-cut timber sat heavy over the water. Their crews moved fast, bolting frames deep into the shoreline like it belonged to them. One of them hammered a sign into the dirt, HOA Private Dock Access, right where my boundary marker used to be. This wasn't just construction. They were taking control of my shoreline, piece by piece, in plain sight. And they thought permits made it legal. I didn't argue. Because I wasn't looking at the land. I was looking at the water they just built into. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm a civil engineer, and this entire lake runs on rights most people never think about. Victoria Hale stepped onto the dock like she owned the horizon, already planning more. And she had no idea how far this was about to go. I stepped closer to the waterline, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil where my survey stakes used to sit. The wood was still warm under my hand, smooth and new, bolts driven deep like they planned to stay. A boat engine hummed somewhere out on the lake, low and steady, like it had already accepted the change. Victoria did not rush. She never rushed. She walked the length of the dock slowly, clipboard tucked under her arm, eyes scanning everything like she was inspecting her own investment. 2 more contractors unloaded planks from a flatbed, stacking them neatly along the shore. This was not a one-time job. This was expansion. I crouched near the edge and dipped my fingers into the water. Cold. Clear. Moving just enough to remind me it was alive. Most people see a lake and think it just sits there. They do not think about flow rates. They do not think about control gates. They do not think about who decides where the water goes. A kid from one of the houses ran past me, dragging a bright blue kayak toward the dock. His mother followed, smiling, already acting like this was a shared space. No hesitation. No permission. Just assumption. That is how this works. You build fast, make it visible, make it normal, and by the time anyone questions it, it feels permanent. Victoria stopped a few feet from me. Her shadow stretched across the water, cutting through the reflection of the sky. We are adding 6 more slips by the end of the week, she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. The community has been asking for this for years. I looked at the line where the dock met the water. The exact point where wood turned into jurisdiction. That thin edge most people never notice. You should have received the notice, she added, like that settled everything. I did receive something. A thin envelope 2 weeks ago, stamped and official looking, buried between utility bills. I had not opened it right away. Did not seem urgent at the time. That was my mistake. Not because of what it said. But because of what it assumed. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off my hands. A second boat idled closer now, its wake gently rocking the new structure. The dock shifted almost imperceptibly, but I felt it through my boots. Not anchored deep enough for long-term stability. They rushed this. Or they trusted the wrong engineer. I walked along the shoreline, counting the posts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one placed just inside what they believed was their boundary. Clean work. Precise. Wrong. I stopped where an old metal marker should have been. Gone. Pulled clean out. No trace left behind. That was not an accident. That was a decision. Behind me, I heard laughter again. Someone testing the boards, footsteps quick and careless. The sound carried over the water, sharp and out of place. Victoria turned to greet another homeowner, already discussing boat sizes and storage fees. She had moved on. In her mind, this was finished. Approved. Locked in. I looked back out across the lake, following the faint line where the current shifted just slightly near the far bank. Subtle. Easy to miss. Unless you knew exactly what controlled it. My grandfather used to stand right here and watch that same line for hours without saying a word. He taught me what it meant long before I ever understood why it mattered. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, scrolling past messages and missed calls until I found the one number I had not used in years. My thumb hovered for a second, then pressed dial. The line rang once. Twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. I kept my eyes on the water as I spoke, voice steady. I need to confirm the old control rights are still active. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Recognition. That was all I needed. Because the moment they answered, I knew something Victoria did not. I kept the phone to my ear as I walked along the edge of the dock, counting each step like I was measuring something only I could see. The water lapped quietly against the new wood, soft but constant, like it was testing the structure. Yes, it is still on record, the voice said. Calm. Certain. No hesitation. I stopped right where the last post disappeared into the lake. That line again. That invisible boundary no one else noticed. And the control authority? I asked. A short pause. Papers shifting on the other end. Then, primary holder. Unchanged. I let that sit for a second. Not relief. Not surprise. Just confirmation. Behind me, a power drill kicked back on, sharp and loud, chewing into another plank. They were extending it already. Of course they were. Expansion always comes before verification. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked up. A pontoon boat was easing toward the dock now, slow and confident, like it had done this 100 times before. The driver waved toward Victoria. She waved back without even checking the structure. Trust built on assumption. That is how mistakes scale. The boat bumped lightly against the side, rubber fenders squeaking as they took the contact. A man stepped out, testing the boards with his full weight. No hesitation. No doubt. The dock held. For now. I walked past them without a word, heading toward the old storage shed near the tree line. The air shifted as I moved away from the water, warmer, heavier, carrying the faint smell of oil and metal from equipment that had not been used in years. The shed door creaked when I pulled it open. Same sound I remembered. Inside, dust hung in the light like it had been waiting. Everything was still there. Coiled cables. Rusted tools. And in the back corner, a metal cabinet with a dent on the side. From something long forgotten. I knelt down and opened it. The hinge protested, slow and stiff. Papers sat inside, stacked neatly, edges yellowed but intact. My grandfather never threw anything away. Not when it mattered. I pulled out the folder wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve. The seal was still visible, faded but clear. County stamp. Year barely readable unless you knew where to look. I flipped it open carefully. Maps. Lines. Signatures. Not just land. Flow. Direction. Control points marked with small symbols most people would ignore. My finger traced one of them. Right near the north end of the lake. I could hear laughter again from the shore, louder now, more people arriving. Engines, footsteps, voices overlapping like this place had always belonged to them. I closed the folder and stood up. Dust settled slowly around me, quieting the space again. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning fog. Everything looked clearer now. Sharper. I stepped back toward the water, folder in hand. Victoria was still there, now talking to a small group, gesturing toward the open lake like she was presenting a finished project. She caught my eye for a brief second. Just long enough to measure me. Then she smiled again. Polite. Dismissive. Like nothing I held could matter. I stopped at the edge and looked down at the water one more time. Still moving. Still following rules older than any permit she had. I tapped the folder lightly against my palm. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a reminder. Because what they built was solid. What I held was permanent. And they had just connected the two. I stepped onto the dock for the first time since they built it, feeling the slight give under my weight. Not weak. Just new. The kind of structure that had not been tested by time yet. The boards were clean, edges sharp, screws still shining in the sunlight. A thin ripple moved under the surface, tapping softly against each post in a steady rhythm. I walked to the end and stopped. Out here, the shoreline disappeared behind me. All that mattered was the water. A jet ski cut across the far side of the lake, leaving a white trail that spread slowly, stretching wider as it reached this side. The wake rolled in, low at first, then stronger. The dock shifted again. Subtle. But real. I turned back toward the shore. More people now. Coolers. Folding chairs. Someone had set up a small speaker, music drifting across the air like this was already a weekend routine. Victoria stood in the center of it, directing placement, adjusting details, building control in real time. She was not just claiming space. She was normalizing it. That is the part most people miss. Ownership is not always about paper. It is about presence. I stepped off the dock and moved along the edge toward the south side, where the land curved slightly inward. Fewer people here. Quieter. The ground felt firmer under my boots. Less disturbed. I crouched and brushed aside a thin layer of dirt near the waterline. The metal edge of an old plate showed through. Still there. They missed this one. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. Numbers etched deep into the surface. Coordinates. Not decorative. Not optional. Fixed. I stood up and looked back at the dock from a different angle. From here, the alignment was clearer. Every post driven exactly where the water rights line shifted control. Not random. Not careless. They followed a map. Just not the complete one. I pulled the folded document from under my arm and opened it halfway, enough to match the marks. The symbols lined up. Perfectly. That was the problem. They built with precision on the wrong layer of authority. A man walked over from the group, holding a drink, casual but curious. Nice setup, right? He said, nodding toward the dock like we were both admiring it. I gave a small nod. It is solid, I said. And it was. That was what made this harder for them. If it had been poorly built, this would be simple. But this was well done. Clean work. Expensive work. The kind you do not walk away from easily. He smiled and headed back, already satisfied with the answer. That is how confidence spreads. One small confirmation at a time. I closed the document and slid it back into the sleeve. The lake surface caught the sunlight now, reflecting it in sharp flashes that made it hard to look straight ahead. I shifted my stance. Slightly, watching how the light broke across the water. There it was again. That faint line. Movement just below the surface, cutting across the reflection at a slight angle. Invisible if you did not know to look. Obvious if you did. I reached down and picked up a small rock, tossing it lightly into the water just past that line. The ripple spread outward, but it bent as it crossed. Direction changed. Flow altered. Controlled. I watched it fade. Behind me, the music grew louder. Laughter followed. Someone started tying another boat to the outer edge of the dock, pulling the rope tight, securing it like they planned to leave it there all season. Permanent decisions made in temporary confidence. I turned away from the water and started walking back toward the house, the document steady in my hand. Every step felt clearer now. Not heavier. Just defined. Because this was no longer about what they built. It was about what they connected themselves to without understanding. And they had just anchored everything to the one system I could still control. I closed the shed door behind me and stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle before the noise from the shoreline reached me again. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying the sound of music and voices across the yard, softer now but still constant. I walked toward the house, gravel crunching under my boots in a steady rhythm, each step matching the pace of something forming in my head. This was not a reaction. This was alignment. Inside, the air felt cooler. Still. The kind of still that holds decisions before they are made. I set the document on the kitchen table and flattened it carefully, smoothing out the edges with my palm. The lines on the map stretched across the page, connecting points that had not been touched in decades. Control gates. Flow directions. Elevation markers measured down to inches. Not guesses. Not estimates. Exact. I traced the main channel with my finger, following it upstream in my mind, past the lake, past the shoreline, toward the structure most people forgot even existed. About half a mile north, hidden behind a line of old trees and a locked service road. The intake gate. Small. Concrete. Easy to overlook if you did not know what it regulated. I opened a drawer and pulled out a key ring. Metal clicked softly as I flipped through them, each one labeled in faded ink. Most were useless now. Old locks. Old systems. Then I found it. A thicker key, worn at the edges, tagged with a number that matched the map. I held it up for a second, feeling the weight of it settle into something more than just metal. Outside, a boat engine revved higher, followed by a burst of laughter. They were settling in. Getting comfortable. That is when mistakes become expensive. I grabbed my jacket and stepped back outside. The sun sat higher now, heat building on the surface of the lake, turning the water from soft gray to sharp blue. The docks were full. People moving across them like they had been there for years. Coolers opened. Lines tied. Conversations layered over each other. Victoria stood near the center again, phone in hand now, probably documenting progress, building proof of use. Smart. Very smart. I walked past without slowing down. She glanced at me, just a flicker, then went back to her conversation. I was no longer a factor in her plan. That was exactly where I needed to be. The path to the service road was narrow, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Overgrown grass brushed against my legs as I moved through it, the sound dry and sharp against the quiet. The air cooled as I stepped under the trees, sunlight breaking into scattered patches across the ground. It felt different here. Older. Untouched. I followed the curve until the concrete structure came into view. Low. Solid. Built to last without attention. The metal gate sat at the front, chain looped through the handles, lock rusted on the outside but still intact. I stepped closer and ran my hand along the surface. Rough. Cold. The kind of texture that does not change no matter how much time passes. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a dull click that echoed louder than it should have. I paused, listening. Nothing but wind through the trees and the distant hum of the lake behind me. I pulled the chain free and opened the gate slowly. Hinges groaned, not from disuse, but from weight. Inside, the control panel sat exactly where I remembered. Simple. Mechanical. No screens. No automation. Just levers and gauges, each one tied directly to the movement of water. I stepped in and closed the gate behind me. The air inside was cooler, carrying the faint smell of metal and damp concrete. I looked at the main lever. Locked in position for years. Stable. Predictable. Until now. I rested my hand on it, not moving it yet. Just feeling the resistance. Because the moment this changed, everything connected to that lake would change with it. I tightened my grip on the lever and felt the weight push back, steady and unmoving, like it had been waiting for someone to challenge it. The metal was cold, but not lifeless. It held pressure. Years of it. I glanced at the gauge mounted just above, its needle resting at a familiar mark, stable within a range most people would never question. Outside, the wind shifted again, and I could faintly hear the distant echo of music from the shoreline, muted by concrete and distance. They were still celebrating. Still settling in. I exhaled slowly and applied just a little pressure to the lever. It did not move much. It was not supposed to. This system was not built for sudden changes. It was built for control. Precision. A quarter inch here could shift inches out there. A few inches could change everything tied to that waterline. I eased it forward slightly, just enough to feel the mechanism engage. A low vibration moved through the structure beneath my feet, subtle but present, like the lake itself had responded. I stopped there. Not enough to notice from the surface. Not yet. I stepped back and watched the gauge. The needle trembled, then settled again, just barely off its original position. That was all I needed. I was not here to flood anything. I was here to remind the system who held authority over it. I turned and walked out of the control room, pulling the gate closed behind me, the chain sliding back into place with a soft metallic scrape. The trees outside swayed lightly, leaves brushing against each other in a quiet rhythm. The path back felt shorter this time. More direct. As I stepped out from the tree line, the lake opened up again in front of me, bright under the midday sun. At first, nothing looked different. Boats still idled. People still moved across the docks. Conversations carried over the water. But then I saw it. The edge. That thin line where water met wood. It had shifted. Barely. Maybe an inch. Maybe less. But the alignment was no longer exact. One of the outer posts now sat at a slightly different angle, its reflection bending where it had been straight before. A man near the end of the dock adjusted his footing, glancing down for a second, then shrugged it off. Too small to question. Too early to notice. I walked along the shoreline again, slower this time, watching each connection point. Every rope tied to a cleat pulled a little tighter. Every boat sat just a fraction differently in the water. The system was responding. Quietly. Consistently. Victoria was still near the center, now speaking with someone holding a tablet, probably reviewing plans or future additions. She gestured toward the far side of the dock, outlining something with her hand, expanding her vision outward. She had no reason to look down. Not yet. A small wave rolled in, slightly stronger than before, tapping against the posts with a sharper sound. Wood answered back with a faint creak. New structures always speak when they are first tested. Most people just do not listen. I stopped at the exact point where the first dock met the shore and looked down again. The water moved differently here now. Not visible to everyone. But clear to me. The flow line had shifted just enough to cross directly under the main support. That was important. That was leverage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the camera and taking a single photo. Not for evidence. Not yet. Just a marker. A reference point. Because this was only the beginning of a change that would not reverse on its own. I lowered the phone and looked out across the lake one more time. Everything still looked calm. Controlled. Functional. That is the illusion people trust. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned slightly, keeping my eyes on the structure as another small adjustment moved through the water beneath it. It was working. Slowly. Exactly as designed. And they were still building more on top of it. The second shift came faster than the first. Not visible at a glance, but enough to change how everything sat on the water. A rope snapped tight with a sharp pull, and one of the boats tilted just slightly off its previous line. The man holding it frowned, adjusting the knot like he had done something wrong. He had not. The system had. I kept walking, slow and steady, watching each reaction ripple outward. The dock no longer floated evenly. Not enough to alarm anyone. Just enough to introduce doubt. A woman stepped carefully across the boards, pausing mid-step as a faint creak traveled under her feet. She looked down, then around, then kept going. People do that. They ignore small inconsistencies when everything else looks right. Victoria did not. Not this time. I saw it in the way she stopped mid-sentence, her eyes dropping briefly to the surface near the main support. Just a flicker. But it was there. She crouched slightly, pressing her hand against the dock, feeling for movement. Smart. She was starting to sense it. But sensing is not understanding. Not yet. I moved closer, staying just outside her immediate space. Close enough to hear, far enough to be overlooked. Probably just the wake, someone said beside her, pointing toward a passing boat. That explanation spread quickly. Simple. Comfortable. Wrong. Victoria stood back up, smoothing her expression, but she did not return to the conversation right away. Her eyes stayed on the water a second longer than before. That was the first crack. I shifted my attention to the far end of the structure. The last section they added that morning. Still the newest. Still the most sensitive to change. A small wave rolled under it, and this time the response was clearer. The outer edge dipped a fraction lower, then corrected itself with a delayed motion. Not dangerous. Not dramatic. But not stable either. A man near the end laughed it off, tapping the board with his foot like he was testing it. He did not realize the timing was off. That delay. That hesitation in the structure. That was not normal. I stopped at the midpoint and looked straight down again. The water line had moved another fraction. The reflection of the posts now broke at a different angle, bending in a way that would not match any original measurement. I knew exactly what that meant. Their entire alignment was drifting out of tolerance. Slowly. Precisely. I pulled out my phone again, taking another photo from the same position as before. 2 images. Minutes apart. Slight difference. That was all it took to prove a shift. I lowered the phone and glanced toward Victoria. She was speaking again now, but her tone had changed. Shorter sentences. Less certainty. She pointed toward the shore, calling one of the contractors over. He walked quickly, wiping his hands on his vest, already looking for something to fix. But there was nothing to fix here. Not at the surface. The problem was not in the wood. It was in what held the water under it. He knelt down, checking bolts, tapping the frame, scanning for anything obvious. Everything looked perfect. That is the trap. When the cause is invisible, the effect feels random. And random problems are the hardest to solve. I stepped back onto the gravel, giving them space, watching how confusion started to spread in small ways. One person adjusting a rope. Another stepping more carefully. Conversations lowering just enough to notice. The music still played, but it no longer filled the space the same way. The lake looked unchanged from a distance. Smooth. Bright. Peaceful. That is what everyone trusted. I knew better. Because I could feel the timing now. The system was responding faster with each minute. Not wildly. Not out of control. Just enough to push every connection point further from where it was designed to be. I turned slightly toward the path leading back to the trees, my eyes still tracking the structure. They were trying to stabilize something they did not understand. And they were doing it on top of a system that was still moving. The third shift did not wait. It rolled in sharper, faster, like the lake had decided to stop being subtle. A hollow knock echoed under the dock, louder than before, would answering pressure it was never aligned to handle. One of the cleats let out a quick metallic ping as the rope stretched tight, then loosened again with a slow slip. The timing was off now. No rhythm. Just correction after correction. I watched a cooler slide an inch across the boards, unnoticed by the group standing around it. Small movement. But it should not have moved at all. Victoria saw that one. Her eyes locked onto it, then snapped toward the waterline again. She did not speak this time. She listened. That was new. The contractor she called earlier was already back on his knees, running a level across the boards, checking alignment that still read perfectly flat. He frowned, flipped the tool, checked again. Same result. Perfect surface. Wrong foundation. I stepped closer to the first post and placed my hand against it. The vibration was clearer now. Not strong. Just constant. A low hum traveling through the structure, coming from below, not above. That is the difference most people miss. Surface problems look loud. Real problems stay quiet until they spread. A boat engine revved nearby, then cut suddenly as the driver looked down, confused by the way his hull sat against the side. He adjusted the throttle, tried to reposition, but the water pushed back at a slightly different angle than expected. He shook his head and tried again. Same result. The lake was no longer responding the way it had this morning. And that changes everything for people who rely on predictability. I took another slow step back, letting the full line of docks come into view. The outer sections were the first to show it clearly now. Not sinking. Not breaking. Just drifting out of perfect alignment, each connection point compensating for something shifting beneath it. Like a grid being pulled just a fraction out of square. Enough to matter. Not enough to panic. Yet. Victoria stood still, completely still now, her attention fixed on the far end where the delay had become visible. Her posture had changed. Less presentation. More calculation. She pulled out her phone, but this time she was not documenting. She was calling someone. Her voice stayed low, controlled, but I could see the tension in her hand where it gripped the device. She was looking for answers. She would not find them on that dock. A sharper creak cut through the air as a section flexed under uneven pressure. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Not stopped. Just thinned out enough to let uncertainty slip in. That is how it begins. Not with a failure. With a question. I looked down one more time at the water near the main support. The flow line had shifted again, more pronounced now, cutting directly across the base of the structure. That was the pivot point. Everything built from that line outward would continue to adjust whether they touched it or not. I pulled the two photos up on my phone, placing them side by side. The difference was small. But it was undeniable. Measurable. That is all the system needed to keep moving forward. I locked the screen and slipped it back into my pocket. Behind me, the trees rustled again, a soft reminder of where the real control sat. I did not need to go back there yet. Not until this reached the point where they could no longer ignore it. I turned slightly, watching as one of the contractors stood up and shook his head, unable to explain what he was seeing. Tools cannot fix what they cannot define. Victoria ended her call and looked out across the lake, not at the dock this time, but beyond it, like she was trying to see something larger. For the first time, she was looking in the right direction. Just not far enough. Because what was happening here was not random. It was not temporary. And it was not going to settle back into place on its own. The fourth shift did not hide anymore. It came through the structure like a quiet correction turning into a pattern. A sharp creak ran the length of the dock, not loud enough to break anything, but clear enough to stop every conversation at once. Someone dropped a rope. Another stepped back without realizing why. The boards did not fail. They adjusted. Slowly. Precisely. And that was worse. I stood still and watched the alignment change in real time. The outer section no longer matched the shoreline. Not perfectly. Not like it had that morning. A gap had formed. Less than an inch. But it did not belong there. Victoria saw it. Too. This time she did not hide it. She walked straight to the edge and looked down, her hand gripping the rail tighter than before. No smile. No performance. Just calculation. Check the base, she said, her voice sharper now. The contractor moved immediately, kneeling again, scanning every bolt, every joint, every visible connection. Everything still held. Everything still looked right. That was the problem. The surface was flawless. The system underneath was not. A boat tied to the far end shifted again, its hull tapping the side with a dull, uneven rhythm. The driver untied and retied the rope, pulling it tighter, trying to force stability into something that was no longer fixed. You cannot tighten your way out of a moving foundation. I took a slow breath and stepped closer to the waterline, stopping exactly where the first post met the lake. The flow line was no longer subtle. It cut clean across the base now, bending every reflection that crossed it. That was the anchor point. The exact place where their entire structure met something they did not control. I crouched down and touched the water again. Cold. Steady. Moving with purpose. Not reacting. Leading. I stood up and brushed my hand dry against my jeans, keeping my eyes on the shifting alignment. The contractor stood up slowly, shaking his head. Everything checks out, he said, but his tone did not match his words. He knew something was wrong. He just did not know where to look. Victoria did not respond right away. She stayed focused on the water, then lifted her gaze past the dock, scanning the lake itself. For the first time, she was not looking at what she built. She was looking at what she built into. That was the moment everything changed. She turned slightly, her eyes finding me without hesitation this time. Not dismissive. Not polite. Direct. Measured. Like she was finally asking the right question without saying it out loud. I did not move. I did not speak. I just held her gaze for a second, then shifted it back to the water. That was enough. Because now she knew this was not random. Another adjustment rolled through the structure, stronger than before, pulling the outer edge just a fraction. Further offline. A small object slid across the boards again, this time noticed by everyone. Silence followed. Not complete. But close enough to hear the dock itself responding. Wood under tension. Metal under load. Water underneath all of it, setting the terms. Victoria stepped back slowly, her eyes still locked on the lake, her mind catching up to something she had not planned for. The people around her waited. For instructions. For answers. For control. She did not have it. Not here. Not anymore. I turned away from the dock and started walking back toward the path, the sound of shifting wood fading behind me. No rush. No urgency. Because this was already in motion. And it would not stop when I left. I reached the edge of the trees and paused for just a second, looking back one last time at the structure stretching out over water that was no longer theirs to assume. They built something solid. They built it fast. They built it with confidence. But they built it on the one thing they never verified. And now, it was the only thing that mattered.